You call yourself ambitious, yet your days disappear into nothing. You speak about the future like it already belongs to you. You imagine success vividly, almost obsessively, yet your body remains still. You are not confused about what you want. You are conflicted about becoming the person who must earn it. There is a silent war inside you that no one else can see. Part of you dreams of recognition, impact, status, freedom. Another part negotiates with comfort, postpones effort, protects energy like something fragile. You tell yourself you work best under pressure, that the delay is strategic. But deep down, you sense something darker than procrastination. What if your laziness is not weakness, but protection? What if your ambition is not drive, but fantasy? And what happens when both live in the same mind? Because the conflict does not exhaust you randomly. It follows a pattern, and that pattern begins with an illusion. Imagine a person who wakes up determined to change everything today. They open a notebook, write bold goals, visualize applause, then close the notebook and scroll for hours. Picture someone who talks passionately about building a business. They research logos, watch interviews of successful founders, redesign their workspace, yet never make the first uncomfortable call. Imagine a student who plans an intense study schedule, color codes the calendar, buys new stationery, announces the comeback to friends, then postpones the actual studying until tomorrow feels safer. In each scene, nothing looks chaotic, nothing looks irresponsible. Everything appears organized, thoughtful, intentional, as if control is fully present and progress is quietly forming. From the outside, this person seems ambitious, structured, even disciplined in preparation, because planning creates the impression of movement without demanding the cost of transformation. There is a subtle comfort in designing a future rather than confronting the present, because imagination offers reward without risk, status without exposure, identity without evidence. The mind becomes satisfied with rehearsing success, as if mental simulation substitutes for execution, reducing the tension that real action would inevitably produce. Research in behavioral psychology suggests that declaring goals publicly can prematurely trigger a sense of accomplishment, weakening the internal urgency required for actual effort. The brain does not easily distinguish between vividly imagined achievement and incremental real progress. It responds to both with small chemical rewards that calm discomfort. This is where the illusion forms, because ambition feels alive, intentions feel pure, and the absence of results can be blamed on timing rather than avoidance. The person believes they are preparing, refining, waiting for the optimal moment, unaware that the optimal moment is a moving target shaped by fear. Control becomes symbolic rather than practical, expressed through lists, plans, and research, while the deeper confrontation with effort remains untouched. They are not inactive. They are strategically busy with everything except the decisive step that would expose their current limitations. And so the conflict grows quietly, because the identity of being ambitious remains intact, while the evidence of ambition remains postponed. The illusion is powerful because it protects self-image, allowing someone to believe they are future-oriented without risking present failure. Yet something begins to fracture when time passes and the imagined future looks suspiciously similar to yesterday. That fracture is small at first, almost unnoticeable, but it carries the first crack in the story they tell themselves. And that crack is where the conflict becomes impossible to ignore. If this is already making sense to you, it means you're starting to notice patterns most people never see. Subscribe, and let's keep exploring how the mind really works. Now, this is where things start to get uncomfortable. Imagine a person who once felt unstoppable at night, mapping out grand plans with electric certainty, then wakes up late, heavy, slightly ashamed, avoiding their own reflection. They still talk about their goals with confidence, but something subtle shifts in their voice, a hesitation that did not exist when the dream felt untouched by reality. One afternoon, they scroll past someone who actually did what they only planned, and a quiet irritation rises, sharp and defensive. They immediately minimize the achievement, telling themselves the other person had advantages, connections, luck, anything that preserves their own narrative of delayed greatness. This is the first crack, not in ambition, but in identity. Because the mind begins to sense inconsistency between self-image and lived behavior, and that inconsistency generates psychological tension. Cognitive dissonance does not shout, it whispers, creating subtle discomfort that demands resolution without revealing its true source. To protect itself, the mind constructs explanations, stories about timing, energy, misunderstood potential, anything that preserves the belief of hidden capability. The person starts saying they are different, that they think deeply, that they refuse ordinary paths, reframing inertia as uniqueness. But beneath that reframing sits an unsettling realization. Progress requires evidence, and evidence exposes current limitations. Ambition without action becomes fragile when confronted by visible results from others, because comparison threatens the fantasy of inevitable success. So the mind tightens its grip on imagination, doubling down on future visions, extending deadlines, promising transformation just beyond the horizon. Each postponed attempt increases the internal gap, widening the distance between who they believe they are and what their days actually produce. That widening gap is exhausting, because maintaining an inflated self-concept requires constant mental negotiation. They begin to avoid environments where performance is measured, choosing spaces where potential is praised but never tested. The first crack deepens not through failure, but through avoidance of failure. And somewhere inside, a quiet fear forms. What if the fantasy survives only because it has never been challenged? That fear does not disappear, it waits. And the brain has already learned how to manage it. Picture someone who receives praise as a child for being gifted, intelligent, full of promise, rarely pushed to struggle, often admired for natural ability. They grow accustomed to approval without sustained effort, associating identity with potential rather than persistence, learning that being impressive matters more than being consistent. Years later, they hesitate before difficult tasks, because difficulty threatens the image they were conditioned to protect. If you have noticed this pattern in your own life, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. The brain is not loyal to ambition. It is loyal to efficiency and emotional safety. When early experiences reward talent over effort, neural pathways strengthen around protecting status rather than expanding capacity. According to research in learning theory, repeated associations shape behavior automatically, especially when approval and identity are involved. If struggle once risked embarrassment or loss of admiration, the brain quietly categorized intense effort as dangerous territory. Avoidance then becomes adaptive, not because the person lacks desire, but because the nervous system prioritizes emotional preservation. Each time they postpone a meaningful task, anxiety decreases temporarily, reinforcing the behavior through negative reinforcement. Relief becomes the hidden reward, subtly teaching the brain that inaction prevents threat. Over time, this conditioning solidifies into a loop. Ambition activates fear of exposure. Fear triggers delay. Delay produces relief. Relief strengthens delay. The individual experiences this not as conditioning, but as fluctuating motivation, blaming energy levels rather than neurological patterns. Yet functional imaging studies show that anticipated evaluation activates similar brain regions as physical pain, suggesting why exposure feels threatening. For someone attached to being seen as capable, visible effort carries the risk of visible inadequacy. So the brain calculates quietly. It is safer to be a person with unrealized potential than a person who tried and revealed limits. Ambition remains intact as an internal narrative, while behavior remains conservative and protective. This is not laziness in the simplistic sense. It is a conditioned defense shaped by years of subtle reinforcement. The conflict intensifies because ambition pushes forward, while conditioning pulls backward, both operating simultaneously. And beneath that tension lies an uncomfortable truth. The brain may actually benefit from maintaining this pattern. The conflict feels painful, but pain does not mean there is no reward. Imagine holding two identities at once, the visionary and the misunderstood underachiever, and noticing how both attract a certain kind of attention. When someone calls you talented but distracted, there is criticism, yet there is also acknowledgement of potential. Potential is seductive because it is limitless. It has no measurable boundary, no public failure, no definitive ceiling. As long as success remains in the future, it cannot be disproven. There is ego protection in postponement. because untested ambition cannot collapse under evidence. Psychologists studying self-handicapping have observed that people sometimes create obstacles to preserve self-worth in case of failure. If effort is never fully deployed, failure can always be blamed on circumstance rather than ability. This creates a hidden payoff, the preservation of identity. You get to believe you are capable of more without confronting whether more is currently possible. There is also emotional comfort in imagining grand outcomes, because fantasy stimulates the same reward circuits as minor achievements. Daydreaming about impact produces a quiet dopamine response, soothing dissatisfaction without demanding transformation. The mind learns that imagination offers pleasure with minimal cost. Meanwhile, real effort carries unpredictability, fatigue, rejection, visible comparison. So the brain negotiates, maintaining enough ambition to feel significant, while avoiding enough action to remain safe. Another hidden reward appears in conversation. When speaking about big plans generates admiration before results exist. You receive social reinforcement for intention alone, which further blurs the line between dreaming and doing. Over time, ambition becomes part performance, part internal reassurance. The conflict persists because it serves a psychological function. You are protected from humiliation, shielded from confirmed limitation, insulated from definitive evaluation. And yet the protection extracts a price: quiet frustration, background shame, private envy. The hidden payoff keeps the system running, but it also keeps you suspended. Suspended between who you claim to be and who you are willing to risk becoming. And that suspension slowly hardens into something more permanent. Imagine a person who introduces themselves as ambitious, visionary, different from ordinary people, yet jokes casually about being lazy. They laugh when deadlines slip. They say they work in bursts. They claim structure suffocates creativity, crafting a persona that explains inconsistency. Over time, others begin to repeat this description back to them, reinforcing the identity of brilliant but undisciplined. If you have seen this pattern in yourself, describe what happened. Someone reading may recognize themselves in it. What began as behavior now solidifies into identity. Identity is powerful because the brain resists information that contradicts it. Neuroscientific research suggests that threats to self-concept activate defensive responses similar to physical danger. So when evidence challenges the story of hidden greatness, the mind protects the story rather than revising it. Laziness becomes reframed as selective energy use. Procrastination becomes strategic incubation. Inconsistency becomes creative temperament. These reframes reduce cognitive tension, preserving coherence at the cost of growth. Eventually, the person is no longer choosing delay consciously. They are enacting a role that feels familiar and safe. The ambitious self lives in imagination. The lazy self governs daily behavior, and both feel authentic. This split creates chronic internal negotiation, promises made at night, compromises accepted by morning. Because identity shapes perception, opportunities that demand disciplined effort appear misaligned with who they believe they are. They may even reject structured success as superficial, elevating struggle as proof of depth. The trap tightens when external validation aligns with the persona, friends describing them as full of potential but unpredictable. To abandon the pattern would require abandoning the narrative that has defined them for years. And losing a narrative can feel like losing a self. So the conflict persists not because it is unsolvable, but because it has become familiar. And familiarity, even when painful, feels safer than uncertainty. What remains is not simply laziness or ambition. It is a story clung to for survival. And that story is more fragile than it appears. Shift perspective to see the conflict not as failure, but as a map of competing needs, each demand carrying its own logic and quiet insistence. Ambition, when observed without moral narrative, appears as a recurrent possibility, a persistent horizon that draws attention without guaranteeing passage or arrival. Laziness, reframed, becomes a feedback signal about cost, energy distribution, and the nervous system's calculation of threat versus reward in everyday tasks. The mind that rehearses success often protects a vulnerable self that once required safety, approval, and pause to survive developmental uncertainties. Look at the pattern as information, not indictment. because patterns reveal priorities, adaptive responses, and the brain's preferred path through emotional terrain. The habitual delay is not always moral failing. It can be a negotiated compromise between desire for status and avoidance of exposure and discomfort. When you separate identity from behavior, the tension becomes more legible, less accusatory, and more amenable to curious observation rather than urgent correction. In this frame, ambition and inertia function like two languages spoken in the same room, each communicating differently about value, threat, and hope. Consider that holding potential is itself a meaningful psychological posture, one that conserves dignity while cataloging future possibilities that remain emotionally safe. Recognize the subtle economics of attention, where imagination earns immediate reward, while sustained effort demands investment that the nervous system may resist. The nervous system's choices are not personal insults. They are conservation strategies shaped by history, context, and the anatomy of experience and threat. Viewing the inner conflict as dialectic reduces moral weight and invites a stance of careful curiosity toward recurring choices and daily rhythms. This vantage allows one to notice when fantasy replaces trial and when comfort is prioritized over exposure, without layering shame onto either impulse. The reframe makes room for paradox, admitting simultaneous longing for achievement and a protective instinct that has never needed public validation to survive. Ambition appears less like a command and more like a returning guest, asking permission to stay, while inertia negotiates terms with guarded insistence and caution. The lazy impulse is not an enemy, but an argument about timing, cost, meaning, and the perceived distribution of risk in ordinary actions. From this perspective, the internal conflict becomes an ongoing conversation rather than a battlefield, each voice offering information about unresolved needs and past lessons. Psychological complexity emerges, revealing that human motivation rarely follows single explanatory arcs. It prefers layered reasoning, contextual calculation, and emotional economy. Stories we tell ourselves about talent and effort are lenses that shape perception, privileging some experiences while excluding others in service of coherence. The reframe invites noticing these lenses without judgment, acknowledging their function in protecting continuity of self and minimizing catastrophic reinterpretation of personal history. In practice, this view lessens the urgency of immediate transformation and increases the clarity of what the tension is actually protecting quietly and persistently. It also reveals how social feedback networks keep narratives alive, friends, mentors, and colleagues reinforcing identity through repeated description and gentle collusion. Understanding the conflict as information reorients the inner conversation, shifting from blame to interpretation, from moral failure to adaptive response and survival strategy. And once the pattern is seen as meaningful data, curiosity becomes the most honest currency for exploring what the conflict continually shows and hides. This reframing does not resolve the tension. It relocates it into a broader landscape of motives, histories, and embodied responses that deserve attention. From this new vantage, the next movement is clearer because observation precedes understanding, and understanding clarifies what parts of the story require further witnessing and further patient exploration. Silence allows the inner conflict to be heard differently, its rhythms clearer, less crowded by urgent narratives and defensive explanations, attention softening around detail. Notice how daily routines carry the imprint of long-rehearsed responses, patterns moving automatically, familiar, carrying both comfort and a quiet sense of stalling. Observe breathing as a simple measure, the rhythm indicating tension or ease, a somatic bell that rings when avoidance has been chosen unconsciously. In the quiet, the biography of desire becomes audible. The layered reasons why certain tasks feel threatening or strangely unappealing reveal themselves gently over time. Reflection here is minimalistic, not an intervention, a calm witnessing of choices, sensations, and the small decisions that accumulate into identity across months. Without urgency, contradictions soften. The mind can sit with two truths at once, longing for achievement and the instinct to preserve emotional equilibrium. Watch how shame arises when plans fail and how shame bends the narrative towards secrecy, hiding attempts from scrutiny to avoid rewrites of self-story. Calm presence reduces the need for immediate resolution, allowing observations about timing, fatigue, and social pressure to surface without automatic justification or dismissal. Attention to small victories matters here. Noticing when curiosity overcame delay, when modest action produced unexpected clarity or relief. These moments illuminate possibility quietly. Rest becomes informative, not indulgent, indicating where capacity actually sits today, the nervous system's true bandwidth, offering data that mere willpower cannot override. Acceptance of current limitations does not imply surrender. It merely acknowledges the system's reality, creating a steadier platform for noticing repeated choices with clarity. Patience in observation removes catastrophic meaning from ordinary setbacks, turning them into signals rather than verdicts, small arrows pointing toward implicit preferences and resistances. Curiosity replaces harsh judgment, asking what the delay communicates about underlying fears, desires, and prior conditioning, shifting the tone from blame to investigation. Notice how social rhythm affects momentum. Invitations, deadlines, and praise alter internal urgency, reminding us that motivation rarely functions in isolation from others. In quiet observation, identity loosens its grip slightly, allowing the ambitious narrative to coexist with practical limits, without either dominating the other's truth completely. Ambient awareness highlights the cost of perpetual postponement, the slow accumulation of deferred experiences, and the private ache of imagined outcomes left untested. Compassionate witnessing recognizes the protective logic behind delay, honoring survival strategies while still marking the fatigue that comes from sustained internal negotiation. Honesty emerges in small increments, admitting when fantasy substituted for testing, acknowledging moments of avoidance without amplifying shame into defining characteristics of self. The quiet shift reframes urgency into temporal curiosity, not asking immediate change, but asking what the present moment is actually inviting, noticing with gentle attention. This is not solution-oriented, it is observant, a recalibration of perspective that privileges patient listening over corrective action and allows complexity to breathe. And with that listening, a new readiness forms, not forced, but slow, a movement toward the next mirror that will ask deeper, harder questions. At some point, the conflict stops feeling dramatic and starts feeling ordinary, woven into mornings, stitched into evenings, quietly shaping the architecture of an entire life. You begin to see how years were not lost suddenly, but diluted slowly, ambition spoken fluently, while action remained hesitant and carefully rationed. The mirror here is not harsh, it is precise, reflecting patterns without exaggeration, showing repetition where you once insisted there was temporary delay. It reveals how often you negotiated with yourself, promising intensity tomorrow while protecting comfort today, believing both promises equally sincere. You notice the subtle pride in being complex, in being someone whose potential feels larger than circumstance, even when circumstance rarely changes. There is an identity satisfaction in imagining that your true capacity has simply not yet been unleashed, as if destiny waits for optimal alignment. The mirror does not mock this belief, it simply places it beside evidence, asking you to observe how long alignment has been postponed. You see how comparison quietly fueled ambition, not from inspiration alone, but from discomfort at watching others convert intention into visible structure. Envy was rarely admitted. It disguised itself as critique, as intellectual distance, as quiet dismissal of paths you feared attempting. The final mirror shows how protection shaped your calendar, how energy was preserved for imagined futures rather than invested in imperfect beginnings. It reflects the evenings filled with research, planning, refining, preparing endlessly for a version of you that never quite arrived. It also reflects the exhaustion of holding two selves at once, the visionary and the avoidant, each demanding loyalty, neither fully satisfied. You begin to sense that the true conflict was never laziness versus ambition, but certainty versus exposure. Certainty lives in imagination, where outcomes obey you, where success unfolds cleanly without interruption or embarrassment. Exposure lives in action, where effort becomes visible, where feedback disrupts fantasy and replaces it with measurable truth. The mirror asks nothing out loud, yet its silence is instructive, showing how often you chose the realm that preserved narrative over the one that tested it. You recognize how often you described yourself in future tense, as if your identity belonged to a later chapter perpetually being drafted. There is a quiet grief here, not theatrical, just the recognition of moments that could have been experiments rather than internal rehearsals. But the mirror also reflects resilience, the fact that ambition never disappeared. It persisted stubbornly despite repeated postponement. That persistence suggests something important. The desire was not fabricated, it was simply entangled with protection. Now the question is not whether you are lazy or ambitious, but which self you have been feeding more consistently. The mirror cannot answer, it only clarifies the pattern. And clarity, once seen, rarely becomes invisible again. The conflict between laziness and ambition is not a personality flaw. It is a dynamic equilibrium maintained by fear, reward, memory, and self-story. For years you may have interpreted it as inconsistency, as lack of discipline, as a mysterious gap between intention and execution. Yet beneath that interpretation lies a more intricate system, one that has been attempting to balance dignity with safety. Ambition kept you oriented towards something larger, preventing resignation, preserving the belief that more was possible. Laziness preserved emotional equilibrium, shielding you from exposure that might have redefined how you see yourself. Together, they formed a loop, frustrating yet strangely stable, painful yet familiar enough to maintain. Understanding this loop does not automatically dissolve it, but it changes how you stand in relation to it. When you recognize the hidden payoffs and protective logic, the pattern becomes less mystical and more transparent. Transparency introduces responsibility, not as pressure, but as awareness of repeated choices and their cumulative weight. Every postponed action, every rehearsed success, every protective narrative contributes quietly to the direction of a life. The tension you feel is not random. It is the signal of competing priorities negotiating inside a single mind. Ambition still whispers, laziness still counters, and the conversation continues whether you notice it or not. What shifts now is not external circumstance, but perception, the ability to see the loop while it operates. And when you can see it, the story loses some of its automatic authority. It becomes something observed rather than something unquestioned. The quiet war inside you does not need dramatic resolution tonight. It only needs honesty. If this reflection felt uncomfortably familiar, stay with that discomfort a little longer. Because sometimes the most significant movement begins not with action, but with seeing clearly what has been repeating. And once you see it clearly, you cannot entirely return to not knowing.